Hi everybody, welcome back to another edition of the Creative Book Club, and today we're looking at Messy by Tim Hartford. If you'd like to see this in more detail, well, hear it in more detail, you can find this on our podcast, so just find that episode. I think it's episode 6, and that will go into more detail. But for now, let me give you a really quick overview of this book. So essentially, the whole idea behind this book is that really, messiness is a good thing in a tidy-minded world. So we have a world in which we tend to think that messiness is bad and tidiness is good, and yet that's not really true. Life is messy, so we need a little bit of a messy approach. Seems to be the point of view of the author. So how is this structured? Essentially, the author takes 9 different ideas of what could be construed as messy, and then goes around trying to find out if that's true or not, if whether that's helpful or not, and especially is looking at lots and lots of different stories. So I really enjoyed this book because of the stories in it. Essentially, it's a collection of short stories that have to do with being messy or not. So the first thing he talks about is creativity, and whether you need to be messy to be creative. Obviously, there's a lot of discussion around this. The typical creative person is messy, is distracted, comes up with different ideas. But apart from mentioning that, he goes into more detail on how can this be helpful. So how does being slightly messy or having a non-direct approach to things help us to have more ideas? He gives an example of the oblique strategies cards used by Brian Eno, and this essentially, these are cards that you just pick a card out of the pack and it might say do something backwards or something really random that is very helpful if you are stuck. If you're stuck in this case, they were working with music. So they're stuck and they can't take the music to the level that they want to. They just seem to be doing the same thing. By taking a random card and just really imposing that randomness on the music seemed to help people to be able to create something new and different. He talks a little bit about algorithms here, and it's interesting, and this was something that stuck in my mind, the idea that it is not necessarily the quickest way to go climbing. So we think that we just need to climb up things, and as soon as we get to the top, then that's the top. But what if we are being asked to find the highest peak on a planet? If we're asking ourselves or an algorithm to find the highest peak on a planet, it's useful to start in a random way. So randomly going to one place on the map or on the planet, seeing how high we are, and deciding at that moment whether to climb or whether to randomly go to somewhere else again and see how high we are. And obviously your chances are going to increase the more you change, the more you do that. But I thought this was really interesting because randomness can really help us to be quicker, although we tend to think that it might not. In the next chapter, he talks about collaboration. And I guess it's not anything new to say that we know that more diverse teams are more productive, they get more things done. But one of the interesting things that he makes is a distinction between this kind of collaboration, which is within a team, very tidy, a lot of, probably bonding together that's important for certain things. And then a type of collaboration which is sort of more dispersed. It's kind of bridging collaboration, bridging between different teams, the ability to collaborate across different disciplines and things like that, which is obviously much more messy. If we want an easy life, we want to speak to people who are similar to us in a similar discipline, and it'll just be much easier because we'll understand each other. But we won't necessarily come up with the best solution, the best product, the best service, or whatever we're doing. So it's better to work with people bridging across different distinctions. But that, of course, is messy. So the next area he talks about is the workplace. And I think this is one of the things that comes to mind when we think about messiness, is how messy is your desk? And he gives a few stories and examples about companies who really tried to control the messiness of the desk. They really kind of made everything open plan, nothing personal. You couldn't personalize your area in any way. You even didn't have the same desk every day. This kind of thing that we can see now, and we may see more of in the upcoming months, because people are working sort of 2 days at home, 2 days in the office, and so the office can be smaller and it can be more of a shared space. But what research has shown, and what the stories that Tim Hartford relays show, is that this is really bad for our work. So people are actually more productive if they are able to personalize their space in one way or another. They don't need to have an entire office that is full of all their knickknacks and things they need, but just a small amount of personalization, this small amount of being able to make themselves feel more comfortable and feel more empowered really helped for the productivity of those people, and of course for how well they felt about themselves and the work and all the rest of it. So a little bit of messiness was very helpful in getting more productivity. The next chapter is all about improvisation and how it's often, a good idea to be able to improvise, that we need to be able to react to the situation. Improvisation is messy. And one of the key things that he says in this, which I think is really interesting and really important, is that it's not that you don't prepare if you do improvisation. If you improvise a speech or something like that, to do that kind of thing, you need to be super prepared. You need to be really, really well versed in the kind of thing you want to say and in making things up as you go along. And that was something that he talks about the Martin Luther King speech. And I didn't know until I read this that most of I Have a Dream speech was improvised. And yet it was improvised by someone who knew a lot about public speaking, who felt comfortable, and even if he didn't feel comfortable at that very moment, was very, very well practiced. So this idea that we need to be a little bit messy. You can't plan for everything. You need to be able to be a little bit messy. And how do you deal with that? Well, you prepare for it beforehand. There's a chapter about winning and competing and how might you compete against someone else. A lot of the information here is about war stories and also politics. The interesting thing here, I think, is the takeaway that being messy can disarm your opponent. So it can disarm your opponent literally in a war situation. They don't know what you're going to do, and so therefore they can't interpret it and plan a counterattack. Or in politics, it can be that you're creating a distraction from what's really going on or slowing people down in their response. So there, of course, I'm referring to some US politics with Trump and with more professional politicians, and the difference between that communication. And one thing is messy and one thing is a tidy, organized approach. The next thing is all about incentives, and basically says we need to be really careful on how we build our incentives because when you put an incentive in place, you're talking about putting a structure on something that's complex. So if we think about trying to incentivize GPs, this is an example given in the book, we're incentivizing general practitioners, medics in the UK to make sure that people can get their appointments quicker. Depending on how you design that incentive, you can create other problems, such as they don't answer the phone, or it is impossible to get through, because they know that if they answer the phone, they've got to be able to give that appointment in a certain amount of time, and yet they can't do it because that problem hasn't been solved. So we need to be very careful on what the problem is and how we are designing the incentive towards the solution, not towards kind of trying to get around. The next messiness is talking about automation. Automation solves our human messiness, but does that create more problems itself? Tim uses a whole load of examples on this, notably the example of the Air France plane that went down in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And essentially the problem there was that the pilots were so used to flying on autopilot or with assisted flying that they really couldn't fly the plane properly, or they weren't used to flying the plane properly. And so automation can help us in small things, but in larger things, if the automation fails, it can create a massive mess that we don't want to have to deal with. So what the author says is that we need to be careful how we use automation, because it can dumb down our ability to be able to respond. So how can we use automation to support human thought rather than replace it? So keeping some of that messiness in there, because we need that in order to be able to discern what to do. The next section is all about resilience. It's talking about how basically hedging your bets and having your eggs in many baskets, having a more messy approach, can be a better way of surviving. It talks a lot about cities and the fact that cities that are able to have a more diverse economy do better. Also parts of cities that are able to have a mixture of different people living in them do better because they're using all the space all the time rather than having everybody leaving for work 9 to 5 and everybody home at the same time. And yeah, talks a little bit more about how to overcome some of the issues that might come from being very, very ordered, and that messiness can help you to be more resilient. The last one Tim talks about is life, and this is kind of a catch-all here to throw in some other bits and pieces. Things that stick in my mind here, the idea of zero inbox. I think we've all been plagued by this, and those of us like me that kind of not that, I'm organised but not that tidy. I hate the idea of zero inbox, although I've tried it several times. And essentially, the author cites some information here which basically says that it's actually quicker just to have everything in the same place and to search it than it is to search through separate folders, which is pretty much what I'd found with myself. And talks a bit about playgrounds as well. And this is quite interesting to me, partly because I've got 2 small kids, but the idea is that children are actually more careful in a playground that looks more dangerous than they are in a very safe playground. So we tend to think of the good playgrounds being the ones with the bouncy floor and everything's all kind of very tidy and very organized and doesn't look like you could hurt yourself very much. Whereas there's research to support that if children are put into a more dangerous looking playground, then they look after themselves better and they tend to have fewer accidents. So essentially, I thought it was a really interesting book. Not just the obvious thing about mess, going into what could mess mean, what are the different types of approaches to messiness, and how can we see whether that is useful or not useful. Obviously, the agenda here, the idea behind it was that, yes, it is good to be messy, or at least it's good to be messy sometimes. And that's exactly what the author goes on to prove. So I'd recommend you read the book. It's a good read. It's got lots of good stories in it. It's really nicely written. And so, yeah, go and buy it.